Okay, everybody, it is 4 o'clock. Hello again, my name is Jerome Bailey. I am a team member with the ESRD NCC. We hope you are enjoying today's sessions. I know I've learned a lot from our speakers today. Let's start our next session. Next slide, Matt. So, here we go. Our speaker today is Dr. Daniel Sukur from the Rogosin Institute. Dr. Sukur is currently the Director of Behavioral Health at the Rogosin Institute, a kidney treatment and research institute in New York City. He received his PhD in clinical health psychology in 2002. His research and clinical focus have been on the psychosocial issues relevant to patients with end-stage renal disease. He has done novel work developing and testing treatments for depression, insomnia, pain, adherence, and anxiety for people with renal failure. He lectures frequently on psychosocial issues for patients with chronic kidney disease and has written extensively in the scientific literature, with his work cited over 3,500 times. He is also the lead editor of the recent volume, Psychosocial Issues in Chronic Kidney Disease. Please welcome Dr. Sukur.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to speak with you all today about this topic, which is actually a fairly difficult topic to talk about. As you heard from the introduction, I'm a clinical psychologist. I spend most of my time working directly with patients with renal disease, and over the years, unfortunately, I've heard a lot of challenging stories, and in particular, in this last year, dealing with the pandemic, these stories of loss and grief. So I've put together some resources today to kind of help people think about the process that they're going through if they're going through a loss, and to really help them feel that they are not alone in going through this. I will speak for a little bit, and then I hope to open this up for questions, and we can have some sort of dialogue to the extent that these webinars allow. Next slide, please. So here are the stages of grief, and if you have watched a movie or seen a TV show about grief, they will often reference this. It's Dr. Kubler-Ross did this work in the 1970s. And I think it's helpful to kind of just walk through what the different stages of grief are. So the first one is often described as denial, which is a normal reaction when people are feeling so overwhelmed by the emotions that they're feeling. And it actually is pretty helpful to people because the shock of the loss can be very extreme, and the denial or not facing that reality all at once is a mechanism that we can use to deal with it on our own time. And then typically after denial passes, we move on to the next stage, which is anger. And if we're angry, that often helps people feel a little bit better about their pain. We can lash out instead of lashing in. And it makes, it's one more step in this process of moving from denial through anger and then to the next stage, which is bargaining. And, bargaining, I could accept this if this happened. What if that had happened? What if this had happened? And again, it's like the beginning of coming to peace. We're beginning to wrap our mind around the fact of what has really happened and the sense of the loss that we are experiencing. And then after that, people often go on to what is called depression, but it is not really a clinical depression, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later. But this is the kind of depression where it's appropriate to the type of loss that you've experienced. And people who are going through this often feel sad, they'll have their sleep disturbed, and they'll have changes to their appetite. Those are all pretty common, but it's still not quite a clinical depression, but it's just a really difficult, sad phase. And then out of that comes this stage of acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean that you're okay with it, but it means that you really understand and have kind of come to peace with the fact that this has happened. Not that you approve of it, but you're really allowing, you're finding a way to incorporate this into your life moving forward. So Dr. Kubler-Ross described these, 50 years ago, these stages. And what we have learned since then, and I've added these kind of arrows in the middle, is that it's not really a process that we go from 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5 in a linear or straightforward fashion. But rather what we've learned over the years is that people jump around from all of these different cycles, all of the different stages, to cycle around. One day you might be in the bargaining stage, and then you feel like you've moved to acceptance and you're doing well, but then the next day you might wake up and find yourself angry again. And this is a slow process that kind of, falls back upon itself as we slowly move forward through the different stages, moving our way towards acceptance. Next slide. So I'd like to go through the common signs of grief and some things that we know about grief. So the most important thing I think that I'm going to say today is that there's really no right way to experience grief. So many people will come and tell me, I didn't cry, or I've been crying for 2 weeks. Does that seem right to you? And, there really is no right way to experience grief. We'll talk a little bit more about perhaps when it crosses a line to requiring some professional help. But for most people, there's a really wide range of experiences that can happen when people grieve. And I'll go through just a few examples of them. At times, people have changes to their emotions. Obviously, people can be sad, and they can feel, at times, they can feel guilty or angry. Sometimes people feel relief. They might even feel joy, isolation, or numbness. All of these different feelings, depending upon, the type of loss that you've experienced and your emotional style, might all be appropriate given the circumstance. One of the most common symptoms that people have when they are going through a loss is difficulty sleeping. And what happens frequently is that during the day, people try to distract themselves. They occupy their mind with other things, with the business at hand. And then when they get into bed, there's no longer any distraction left, and all those difficult thoughts come pouring into their mind. And it can be very difficult to fall asleep. And, when we talk about people who are having difficulty falling asleep at night or staying asleep through the night, we call that insomnia, and insomnia is fairly common. In fact, insomnia is very common in patients who are receiving renal replacement therapy, even if they're not going through a grieving process at the moment. We know that about 50 to 60% of patients who are on dialysis will report some difficulty sleeping. So there's already this kind of baseline level of really hard, hard times falling asleep. And then on top of that, having grief and all of the other challenges of the emotional processing of the loss can really interfere with people's ability to get to sleep. Another common sign that people have is they have changes to their thinking, where it's common to become preoccupied with thoughts, memories, or images of the loss throughout the experience of the grief, and they can find it hard to concentrate on other things at hand. So I guess there's really two parts to this. The first part is that all these thoughts are constantly coming to mind, and we'll talk a little bit more a bit later about intrusive thoughts, but just everything serves as a reminder for some of the memories of the loss. And that in and of itself can be occupying to your mind. But then also, when people are occupied or they're just not feeling 100% clear, then they find it difficult to concentrate. And when you're not concentrating, often it feels like you're having memory difficulties. It's not really a memory difficulty in the sense that it was never in your head in the first place, so it's not that you forgot it, it's that you didn't attend to it, you never really paid attention to it in the first place. So these are pretty common. Sometimes people will think that they're beginning to have, some neurological difficulties themselves, like, oh, what's going on? I can't seem to remember things. I seem to be forgetful. And then when you kind of drill down a little bit, you start to realize that really what this person is just overwhelmed. Their mind is so busy dealing or trying not to deal with the grief and the loss, that there's not really much space left in their mind to take in new information. Next slide. And sometimes people can even have strange experiences. They can hear the voice of their deceased loved one or see their image, and it's pretty common in the grieving process, particularly in older adults who have lost their life partner. Sometimes, if that experience happens to people, they can be quite frightened by it because they'll understand that, it's not real, but they're not sure what to make of it, whether they're, going crazy. They're not sure what to make of it, but it actually is a fairly common experience. And I think, the way that we can think about that is if we imagine our minds, our brains are really a series of interconnected pathways. And, if there are certain pathways that are well traveled, then there's these connections between different areas of our brain which form, like a highway, like an easy to travel route. So if we get used to something, and it's associated with something else, we begin to experience those things even with the absence of it. So for example, if somebody wakes up in the morning every day and kind of, puts their feet down onto their carpeting every single morning, after years and years and years, you'll have an expectation that the carpeting will be there. And sometimes, if you move, people will kind of put their feet down in the morning and they'll say, oh, I thought I felt the carpet when I first put my foot down. There's an association that's built in the brain between the memory and the sensory areas that, you're remembering something, but you're also feeling like you're hearing it or experiencing it. So it's not really a sign of any sort of mental illness. What it is a sign of just kind of the amazing ways that our brain helps us make sense of the world around us. And if we are, living with someone for years and years, then, they work their way into these highways inside of our brain. So, it's fairly common for people to say, they woke up in the morning and they had the sense that their partner was next to them. And I think you can understand that if somebody is, spends, decades sleeping next to someone else, that, there's a sense with of that loss, and that, small reminders can make them think that they're back to kind of that highway, that commonly traveled path. The next one is changes in intensity of grief. So for most people, the intensity of the grief fluctuates over time. There's generally a trend towards the grief being less intense, but then there are significant moments that might, cause a spike in the intensity of the grief, like a birthday or an anniversary or a life event. And all of those things, are really normal in the sense that, the loss is felt more acutely during those moments. So therefore, there's kind of an increase in the amount of grief that the person is experiencing. So those are all signs of typical grief. And what I have here is something which is called complicated grief, which is when the process may not be proceeding as normal. And this is where, at times we can become a little concerned as to whether this grieving process is on track or in a healing direction. And we know that some of the signs or the risk factors for having a complicated grief are a complex relationship with the deceased. So if it's, an estranged parent, if it's someone that you were arguing with or someone that you have not, have mixed feelings about, so then it becomes harder to really grieve that person because there's all these other emotions which are mixed in. Another sign, or another risk factor for complicated grief is the loss of future plans and dreams. So, there's a loss that's experienced when the person leaves your life, but then there's also, for some people, a very dramatic change in what the next, years of their life might look like now that they've lost someone who's close to them. I was recently working with somebody who experienced a loss and was kind of wondering why he wasn't getting it over it more quickly. And, as we spent more time talking about it, it was exactly this. It wasn't only the loss of his life mate, but it was really a loss of, all of the hopes that he had had for the plans that he had had for the next years of his life, of what his retirement was going to be like, and he felt like he had worked so hard on saving money and kind of getting into a position where he would be able to enjoy his retirement, and now that his wife was taken by COVID, he was, mourning the loss of her, but also, the loss for himself of what is he going to do now? How is he going to kind of have meaning in this time in his life? And I think, if we're talking about COVID loss, unfortunately, there are so many people who have been taken before their time. So there's a lot of, as many people, all of their loved ones had future plans and dreams that often included a lot of the people that have passed. So this can be particularly difficult now. Another risk factor for complicated grief is also guilt over how the person died. And I'm here in New York City, and we've been hit very hard by the epidemic. And unfortunately, there's just some really terrible things probably true across the country, but I've witnessed for myself just some really difficult experiences of having to be on the phone with the person who's passing away, family not being able to visit for the weeks before the person passed away or even after. And that has that engenders a tremendous amount of guilt. They wish they could have been there. They wish they could have helped ease their way in whatever that might mean to the family. But I've heard this theme again and again over the last few months. And then finally, the last risk factor for complicated grief is when the loss is compounded by other losses. So it's not just one loss that happens, but a variety of losses. And a classic example of this, if there's a car accident and more than one person was lost, that it becomes exponentially more difficult to grieve those losses. And what I'm hearing from people is that to some degree that is the experience that this pandemic has caused. It's one loss after another, both in terms of loss of life, but in terms of all the other losses that we are all experiencing. And it's we're already kind of pushed past our limit of how well we are coping, and then to have the loss of a loved one on top of that can really make the grieving process very difficult. It's all the anger and the resentment towards the pandemic and the whole situation that we are in as a country, as a world. All of that frustration and difficulty and anger then becomes kind of mixed together with the loss of our loved one, and that can become, compounded. They mix together, they kind of add upon one another, and that makes the loss all that much more difficult to grieve. Next slide. So here's a slide which is what I've called stuck on grief, and this is some signs that perhaps the grieving process is not moving along the way that Dr. Kubler-Ross had outlined people typically grieve. So the first one is that the intensity and duration of the grief don't seem to be changing. Like I said before, as long as the trajectory is generally towards acceptance and easier grieving, then we're generally not concerned. But if time has passed and that intensity of that grief and the duration of the grief doesn't seem to lessen at all, so then we might become concerned that this person is kind of stuck in this process and there's something not, that is preventing them from moving forward to the next stage or to, moving forward in their own grieving process. The second one is intruding thoughts. And I had mentioned before that when we have a lot of thoughts about someone, it can interfere with our concentration. This is maybe one step further on that spectrum. So it's not only that we're thinking about that person, but it's even when we're actively trying not to think about that person or the loss, those thoughts come in. So they're unwanted thoughts that come into your mind and can really interfere with your functioning, interfere with what it is that you're, if you're trying to make dinner and you can't stop thinking about replaying a certain scene or a certain conversation or an experience of the loss, it is obviously very difficult to just kind of push that aside and to be able to move forward. So intruding thoughts, which is, one step up from just the preoccupation or thinking about somebody, that might be a sign that things are not things are not progressing well, especially if it's, after the first weeks of the loss. The third is the inability to accept the loss. So, like we saw from the first slide or from those stages, that acceptance, basically saying that this has happened and I need to find a way to make life make sense given that this has happened. That's what acceptance really means. And if people are unable to get there, if they're just not willing to accept that this has happened, then they can stay stuck for a long time in their grief. The fourth one that I have here is, avoiding reminders. So there are all, for everyone, there's different challenges or, particular difficulty around certain things that might remind you of the person or might remind you of the loss that you've experienced. For those of you that have ever purchased a house or got a new apartment, from someone that has passed away, you can kind of often feel the difficulty that the people have in clearing out the home of the deceased belongings, how difficult that is. And that's, pretty standard. And, but those are the types of things that, people might try to avoid. If it gets to the point where they're not able to do the activities that they need to do to be able to grieve, so then it might be a sign, again, that they're stuck in grief. The fifth one is a loss of meaning or purpose. And, I think this is worth, kind of pausing and thinking about for a moment, that for a lot of people, it's the quality of our relationships, it's the people in our lives that really provide meaning or purpose to what it is that we do. And, there's a very strong positive side to that, which is that, you can have a life filled with meaning and with love. But there's also a dark side to that, is that in the absence of that person, you can feel at a total loss of your own personal meaning or your own personal purpose. And we know that having meaning and purpose is kind of a basic human need for being able to successfully function in this world. There are philosophers, psychologists who are known as existential thinkers, people that wonder about our existence and what are the key features of what we need. And one of the main kind of commonalities amongst these thinkers is that we all need a purpose. We all need to feel like what we're doing is significant in some way to other people, to the universe, to ourselves. And that without this meaning or purpose, life becomes more of a chore than an opportunity. And if there's this switch for somebody that, they used to look forward to their days to fill their time with, so many things that they wanted to do, and now they just feel like they're kind of watching the clock on each day, wondering what to do to fill their time. So that might be a sign that the grief is hitting perhaps a bit harder than would be expected. And then the last one on this page, number 6, is the sense of responsibility for loss. And at times that sense of responsibility can be kind of appropriate to the events that have occurred, and sometimes it is totally, just inappropriate, and it's just, an expression of the guilt that we are feeling really for no reason. One person I was working with that unfortunately, her sister had passed away to COVID, and she felt this tremendous sense of responsibility because she had allowed, in her mind, her sister to kind of do some of the activities that she thinks perhaps put her at risk for contracting the illness. And just in talking it through, we don't know how she caught COVID. We don't know that it was those particular events that they had talked about. And also she was an adult who made her own decisions, and she chose to kind of do what she wanted to do, and by no means was that what she wanted to happen, but the sister kind of took an inappropriate amount of responsibility for not preventing her sister from doing what she wanted to do. And in my mind, that was really just kind of an expression of grief that is a little bit of concern, because those are the types of thoughts that can haunt people for a long time. Next slide, please. So I thought we could talk briefly about the differences between grief and depression. So grief is about emptiness and loss. But depression is really about low mood. And, you know, it's possible to be grieving somebody and to feel at a loss, but still kind of understand that there are things in life that provide pleasure. There are things in life that will cause you happiness in the future, as opposed to when you're feeling depressed. It's a much more all-encompassing feeling, and it's at times difficult to even imagine what pleasure might feel like or that happiness will come in your life at any point in the future. Second is that, you know, sadness, which is part of grief, usually comes in waves. So you can have, you know, days where you're feeling pretty good, and then a wave of grief will come over. It could be moments, could be days. Everyone kind of experiences it differently. But the low mood that people have when they're depressed is generally more persistent. It's a longer lasting, kind of unrelenting low mood. And, you know, when you ask somebody, you know, why are you feeling down right now? If they kind of tell you, oh, I was thinking about, you know, my lost loved one, that sounds more like grief. But if they tell you, I don't even know why I'm feeling so down, that might sound a bit more like depression. I guess similarly, you know, grief-related thoughts tend to be around the loss and the person who they're missing, as opposed to in depression, you know, the description of the thoughts that there tend to be global, which means, you know, kind of much more broad, and they tend to focus on the self, the world, and the future. This is a kind of common pattern we see in people who are depressed. We call it the negative triad. It's this negative group of thoughts that people have about themselves, about the world in general, and about the future. So it's, if something bad happens, it's not because it was random or because of someone else, but it's because of me. I did this. I was the cause of this. And it's not that this was an isolated event, but rather that this is, you know, a pattern that is stable and kind of global. This is how the world works. These things happen to me. I make these things happen. And also that they're likely to reoccur in the future. This is what my future, you know, this is what I have to look forward to. And obviously you can see someone who has these really negativistic beliefs would have to be depressed and have a really, you know, kind of poor sense of what the future might hold for them. And the last one is you know, low self-esteem, worthlessness, and self-loathing are common in depression, but when in grief, you don't usually see those things happen. You see people kind of being sad about the loss, but they don't really change the way that they feel about themselves. So if you're beginning to think about, you know, am I experiencing this loss in a healthy way, or am I experiencing this loss in an unhealthy way? Hopefully some of these are some guides to thinking about that perhaps either you're on the right track or is moving forward, or they might not be. Next slide. So I have kind of compiled this list of 10 tips for successful grieving, and I think some of it might sound a little familiar, but I wanted to make this, you know, about a successful experience that people can have even though they've gone through something which is really challenging and difficult. So like I said at the outset, there's really no right or wrong way to grieve. Some people need to distract themselves. Some people want to be alone. Some people want to talk a lot about the loss. Some people only want to talk about the loss. Some people don't want to talk about the loss. I think, you know, giving people the space to grieve in the way that they feel is right for them is probably the right way to handle it. Number two is that there's no universal timeline for grief. So how long does it take? So we don't really know how long it takes. I think that there's a rough estimate that at 6 weeks, people should feel a little different than they did right away. You know, that initial wave of grief begins to subside at 6 weeks. And then if not by 6 weeks, at 6 months, we look back and we say, well, has this person made substantial change in the way that they are grieving? The third one is, you know, you have to accept that grief can trigger many emotions, and that, you know, like, you know, sometimes people have an expectation as to when they're feeling grief that they should, you know, I don't know, cry or feel sad. But we, like I said earlier, we might feel a whole variety of these emotions, sometimes exclusively and sometimes you know, all at the same time. You know, we can feel angry, shock, guilt, relief, loneliness. I remember an experience that I had where I was at a family member's funeral, and the person who had passed away kind of on their own terms. They had decided that they didn't want to go and pursue aggressive medical treatment, and they had accepted that their life was, you know, that they were prepared to end their life at that point, and they ended up passing away. And for so many people there, you know, that was celebrated. That decision was celebrated. You know, they kept on saying she died as she lived on her own terms. You know, but there were some people there, some relatives, who just were overwhelmed with the anger at the decision that she made. And you know, I think the job that we have is to really kind of understand, you know, the process of what made people go through the decisions that they made or the events that occurred, and then to kind of just own our feelings in reaction to it and let them out. You know, let those negative feelings get expressed. And sometimes it's a combination of all of these. And you know, the more that we can express the emotions, the less they become bottled up inside of us and kind of, you know, serve as toxic poison for us as we begin to move forward. Next slide, please. So number 4 is to take care of yourself physically so that you can take care of yourself emotionally. You know, so many times, you know, when people are grieving, they forget to eat. They might, you know, kind of just grab whatever's in front of them. They don't sleep right. So we need to really pay attention to our bodies and to make sure that our physical needs are taken care of. So, you know, that means eating right, sleeping right, and exercising. You know, we are born or designed to be in rhythm. So the more kind of cyclical our sleep, eating, and exercise is, the more healthy we feel, the more kind of on point we might feel. And something like grief might knock us out of that natural rhythm. So, you know, one of the ways that we can try to be as maximized as we can is to try to preserve those natural rhythms. Number 5 is practice self-compassion. To release all expectations on how you think you should feel. So, you know, so many people are kind of really torn and bothered by, you know, what they think that they should be feeling. If I was a good son, I would be feeling this, or if I was a better wife, I might be feeling that. And again, you know, there's really no right way to grieve, and, you know, allowing people to experience their emotions in the way that they come is the best way to support that person and the best way we can support ourselves. And number 6 is the initial grieving period may feel exhausting. Sometimes, you know, it can come with a lot of responsibility, you know, of planning a funeral or whatever events might occur around the death, and it's just so exhausting. And I think that's pretty common. And, you know, you have to allow yourself time and space to feel that exhaustion, the emotional exhaustion, the physical exhaustion. It's probably not the best time to make big decisions or to start new projects for yourself. Allow yourself that time to just say, you know what, I'm going to be, you know, down and out for a little bit. And then, you know, as I begin to recover, I can kind of return to some of these other matters that are in my life. Next slide. So we want to encourage people to stay active. The more exercise that they can get, you know, kind of the more emotional energy that they can achieve in a healthy way. Again, you know, during COVID, it is particularly challenging to staying active, even for those of us that are not going through a grieving process. It can be particularly difficult. So, you know, finding creative ways of being active. And for people that are, not, athletes, the amount of activity is probably not all that much that would be required to have some positive emotional energy from it. You know, exercise is great for your body and great for your emotional world. And, the amount of benefit that you get from just a tiny bit of exercise for your emotional health is actually quite high. So you don't have to do a lot to feel good. You just have to do something, and usually people report feeling a lot better. Um, when we're grieving, we can feel like we're going through something which nobody else has gone through or is very isolating. And it can be very helpful to join a support group, to talk to friends or family, just to tell people, what we're going through and how we're experiencing it. And, one of the obviously great challenges of the pandemic is the isolation that it causes. But as a result of that, there are so many resources which are available now online or through Zoom or on the phone. There's just more opportunity to kind of connect to some of these resources for people that may not feel as comfortable even in regular times, to go sit in a room and talk to other people. Number 9 is to plan ahead for upcoming dates that may trigger grief. Anniversaries, holidays, birthdays, all the times that might be really challenging. To have a plan for yourself. How are you going to handle that? Are you going to mention that person at the next holiday? Are you going to commemorate them in some particular way at a milestone event? Sometimes having a plan for it gives you an outlet for the grief, and it doesn't intrude into the other parts of the day, so you are able to still enjoy the holiday but still not feel guilty about it, as you are able to acknowledge the loss that you're experiencing. And then number 10 is try calming strategies, whether it's deep breathing, prayer, yoga, meditation, whatever you like, whatever fits your lifestyle. Do something which is helps center you and helps you become a bit calmer, a bit more focused in your thinking. All of these exercises, have been around for thousands of years and used for a variety, across all cultures. And, there is something to it. It certainly helps people feel more calm and feel more in control. And, I've kind of gone through all these tips, I guess, or suggestions for successful grieving. But, for some people, it does become a bit too much, and the grieving process does not progress in the way that they would like it to. And at that point, that's the time to reach out to a professional. And like I said before about some of the support groups, there's teletherapy options that are available now, and they're so much easier to access them than they were before the pandemic. So there really, in my mind, should be a very low bar as to when you feel like it's the right time to reach out for people. And I think anybody kind of going through a traumatic loss probably would benefit from some support. And if you don't have those people naturally occurring in your life, then you should probably reach out and have a conversation with a professional. Next slide. And this is my last slide. And this is really about how the need to modify some of these things during COVID-19. And for some people, this is a major challenge for them, that they're not able to do the traditional burials or funerals or mourning processes in the way that they would like to. And I acknowledge that it is a real challenge, but unfortunately it is a reality. There are many challenges that that COVID-19 has brought to us. This is just one more. And, from challenge sometimes comes opportunity. What I would tell people is, think of a way that you can use the resources that we have to honor the loss or the memory of the loved one in some way. I was just speaking with someone who, let's say in their tradition, in their faith, the funeral would have been very quick right after the person passed away. And the funeral was, and because of COVID restrictions, nobody was able to attend the funeral in person. And they felt this was such a tremendous loss, that they couldn't pay their last respects to in this case, it was their father. And they decided to create a Zoom, meeting where people could come and just kind of, pay their respects and share stories. And, they told me that they would have expected, there would have been 20, 30 people that might have come to the funeral, but they had over 100 people come to the Zoom because obviously you can schedule it. It's a lot easier to attend with people from across the country, from across the world. So, they had this really beautiful experience, and they got to in essence, kind of create their own ritual around how they think this service or ceremony should go. And it was very, very meaningful to them to be able to not just kind of honor the tradition, but to really honor their own interpretation of that tradition in this more modern way. So it is true that there is a great amount of loss, but I think that, you know, through all of this, if we are able to focus on the things that we are able to do and the things that are within our control, it can help us feel much better as we begin to grieve and move forward with our lives. So I am very happy to answer some questions or to hear some comments that people have. I see there's one question. Should I just go ahead and read that one, or someone want to read it?
You can go ahead and read it and answer.
Okay. So the question is, how best to support a loved one who is going through a difficult time when they say, leave them alone? Is that wise? How do you help them discreetly? That's a very challenging question. Certainly people have different communication styles. And sometimes people like to talk it out. Sometimes people don't like to talk it out. What I would say in that scenario is that, you know, if you know this person well, and you know, A, that they really are suffering internally, but they're just not showing it, and B, they're not ever going to talk about it. So then what I think I would do is I would just ask them. I would sit down with them and just kind of say pretty much that. You know, I care about you. I know that you're going through a loss. I know you don't like to talk about things. How can I help you? And if they say, just leave me alone, you say, well, you know, leaving you alone, I understand that, like, right now that might help you, but I'm concerned that in the future, like, if you don't deal with this, you know, or express it in some way, it just might not lend itself to a healthy grieving process. Is there anything that I can do or that you can do to help yourself move along in this process? And there's a chance that they might take you up on that offer and have that conversation with you. And there's a chance that they will say, you know, no, I don't need your help. And I am a believer, actually, that, you know, if people are not ready for the help that you're offering, it might not be the right time for that help. And all you can do is offer people, you know, what we call unconditional positive regard, which means you just tell them, I love you, I'm here for you, whether it's today, tomorrow, next week, next month, whenever it is that you'd like to deal with this or talk about it, if you would ever like to, I'm here for you. And like, they don't get the sense that, you know, they need to do it for your sake, but rather you're just there in a supportive way. Hopefully, if the need does arise, then they'll come and they'll turn to you and they'll be able to, you know, kind of get the support that they need when they're ready for it.
We do have a couple of other questions that came in, and one is, what recommendations do you have to help dialysis staff feel more comfortable talking about grief when a patient dies? I lost a fellow patient and friend, and I feel like the staff isn't comfortable talking about loss.
It's a great question. I mean, I think talking about, it's a very complicated situation. So, you know, I work at a dialysis center. I work kind of, you know, predominantly with the patients, but I also do have conversations with the staff. What I will say is that, you know, the loss, that conversation between a staff member and a patient about a different patient that has passed away is a complicated conversation for them to have. There are rules about you know, the privacy of the deceased patient that the staff member doesn't want to or is not allowed to violate. And you know, very often people want to know how somebody died, what the circumstances were, and that's not really an appropriate amount of sharing. You know, if the staff member does know, which they may or may not know, but even if they do know, you know, that's not really their information to be able to share with a staff, with a patient. So I think that adds some of the maybe awkwardness or difficulty that you see, is that there's some actual lines in the sand about how that conversation can happen. And number two is that staff member probably had a relationship with that patient themselves, and whether they value expressing it or showing it to the other dialysis patients or not, all the staff members become attached to their patients. I mean, in dialysis in particular, you spend so much time together. You really get to know someone. It is, it's a loss for them as well, and it's difficult to help someone else kind of cope with their loss when you are experiencing that loss yourself. So some of that awkwardness that you might see in the dialysis staff member might be their own discomfort with the loss that they're experiencing themselves. And then the last thing I will say is that, well, there probably are some people that are really uncomfortable with having this, despite all those things, that are uncomfortable having those types of conversations. It depends who you're talking about. Technicians tend to be, in my experience, kind of more technically oriented. They like to kind of do things, and they might be a little less, interested in the emotional processing of things in general. In particular, death is always a difficult one for people to help to process and to talk about. So, I think how is the best way to do that? We've had conversations, and I've participated in national conversations about what's appropriate at the dialysis center to acknowledge the loss of patients during COVID, without frightening the other patients, without violating their HIPAA, without, I think every facility kind of does it a little bit differently. So, I think it's an issue, and I think, there's probably more dialogue needed, as you bring up. It's it probably is something that we should include in their education about how to kind of sensitively have some of these conversations with patients.
Thank you. Another question that we got, how can I tell if it's grief or just the normal sleep issues related to dialysis?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And so I spend a lot of my time working with people, who have insomnia or who are depressed, dialysis patients. And what I would say is that, how you have the symptom or why you have the symptom is sometimes not all that important. And it's not really, sometimes those are mysteries that you just can't figure out. Is it related to having renal failure? Is it related to the machine? Is it related to some of the medications I'm taking? Is it related to the emotional universe that I'm in right now? The answer is probably yes to all of them. But you can't really change a lot of those things. So what we try to do is try to look at the factors in your life that you can change. So yes, probably being off dialysis would be better for your sleep health, but obviously not better for your overall health. So that's not something that you can change. Not going through grief would be something which would be better for your sleep health, but clearly not something that you can change. So given that we are in the circumstance that we're in, how do we help? How do we move forward? That's I think is the valuable question. And the answers to those questions usually are around creating healthy habits and healthy rhythms around getting to sleep and staying asleep, as opposed to really kind of figuring out the etiology of the sleep difficulty, because ultimately that doesn't really help all that much.
Yeah. Our next question is, what advice do you have for people who are experiencing anxiety over not seeing their family? Some people haven't seen family in nearly a year when they used to see or spend time with their family maybe once a month.
What advice do I have? Nothing profound except for hang in there. I feel like we're nearing the end of the social isolation restrictions that are upon us because of the pandemic. I encourage everyone, who's eligible and appropriate for the vaccine to get the vaccine. And then I have a sense that in the next few months, as the vaccine becomes more widely available and more people are taking it, we'll be able to see our family members again with, in safety, and it won't it won't be as risky. And we're almost there. And I think if someone would have told us at the beginning of this, it's going to be a year, it's going to be 18 months or whatever it ends up being, that would have been very difficult, but in some ways like a known quantity. And I think the way that it, at least in my mind, it was like, okay, it's going to be a little longer. Okay, it's going to be a little longer. Okay, it's not over yet. It's going to be a little longer. It's just made it so much harder to actually have faith that we're nearing the end. And maybe I am being fooled again, but I do have faith that we are nearing the end of this. And I do think that we are, just kind of hang in there. I would also say, use technology, even if you might not be a technology person. It's not the same. You can't hug through Zoom. It's all, that's all true, but it's still way better than not interacting with people or just kind of staying, by yourself. One story I'll share with you is it was one lady I was speaking with who lives in New York City. She's lives in an apartment by herself. She's in her later 80s, and her family and friends were a major part of her everyday life. And now she was, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, very rightfully concerned that she didn't want to get exposed to them, and she, in essence, locked the door and kind of stayed in there. And she has, 8 grandchildren who are literally on all 4 corners of the earth. And she found a time where they could play some online game, and the kids who are not kids made a commitment to joining her every week for a Zoom call and some sort of online game. And they have been doing it now, I think it's going on 8 months. And she said she now feels closer to these grandkids than she has ever felt in her life, because, usually when they come, it's a brief visit, they talk about how sick she is, and then they leave. But now it's like has this opportunity to interact in a totally different way, on a totally different kind of level as they're playing this game. She feels really close and privileged to be a part of their life. So I'm not saying that she would have chosen this.
That's really cool.
But it's an opportunity.
Yeah. Last question. Is it okay if I don't know why I'm sad or down?
It's a good question. There are probably, unfortunately, no shortage of good reasons to be feeling sad or down these days. But if you feel like, you are feeling down more often than not, then you might be thinking about whether your mood is suffering from a dip or from depression. And, depression is one of those things which certainly you can learn to live with or kind of muscle your way through, but why? There's help that's out there. So I always encourage people, if you're not sure what you're going through, talk to the people that, care about you, and start to get a sense of what their impression is. And, if you want to get some professional advice, that's one thing that usually the dialysis patients have no shortage of, is access to healthcare professionals. Talk to your nurse, talk to your doctor, see if they think a referral is a good idea. I'll say it again, it is so easy during, these pandemic regulations to find a mental health provider through telehealth. It might just be one chat where they can kind of do a evaluation and a screening for you, give you some tips and say, hey, if it gets worse, give me a call, or, let's check back in 6 months if you're doing well. So, it doesn't have to be a very kind of serious entry into mental health treatment. It could just be, a supportive conversation.
All right. Dr. Suker, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate all the great advice you provided today.
You are very welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Next slide, please. So we also want to tell you about some online resources that are available from the ESRD NCC. As we mentioned this earlier, this resource, Tips to Help You Boost Your Physical and Mental Health During the COVID-19 Pandemic. It offers practical tips to help better deal with stress and anxiety. Visit the kidneycovidinfocenter.com and click on For Patients to download that resource. My earpods just died, so let me take these out. And the next slide is the online patient and family member resources. We have information on what to expect as a newly engaged diagnosed patient understanding the grievance process, choosing transplantation, choosing home dialysis, infection prevention, and caregiving. You can also get links to trustworthy organizations by visiting the ESRDNCC.org website and just click on patients. So, and don't forget to follow us on social media. We are on Facebook at ESRDNCC. Follow us on Twitter at ESRDNCC and search YouTube ESRDNCC. Thank you everyone for being a part of our first NPFE-LAN Summit. We hope that you enjoyed the sessions and that you can take at least one tidbit to improve your quality of care and improve your quality of life. The sessions have been recorded and they will be posted to the ESRDNCC.org website. If you have questions about the work of the ESRD-NCC or the ESRD network, please send an email to nccinfo@hsag.com. That's nccinfo@hsag.com. We will be sending everyone that registered for today's summit an evaluation. Please complete the evaluation as soon as possible. Again, your feedback will be very helpful to us in developing future programs. So please complete the evaluation once you receive it. Again, we want to thank CMS, the ESRD networks, our patients and caregiver leaders, and the speakers who made the summit a success. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.